In the chilling rain of New York's bustling streets, a gaunt, silent figure emerges before a glowing butcher shop. A German shepherd, once a proud K9 warrior, now a starving shell with a filthy, matted coat exposing cryptic scars. No whines, no begging, just an eerie stillness as its deep black eyes lock onto slabs of fresh meat. Waiting, but for what? Who cast this hero aside? What turned a protector into this pitiful stray? Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. Thank you. Rain drizzled over the bustling streets of New York, turning the city into a mosaic of distorted lights reflected in puddles on the sidewalk. The air was thick with the scent of wet asphalt, mingling with the aromas of food wafting from nearby restaurants and food carts. Among the hurried pedestrians and the endless stream of yellow taxis, a lone German shepherd sat motionless in front of a brightly lit butcher shop. His dark eyes were fixed on the slabs of fresh meat hanging behind the glass, but he didn't whine, didn't bark, didn't even wag his tail. He just waited. His thin frame told a cruel story of too many days without a proper meal. His once thick coat was now dull, matted, and streaked with dirt, with small patches of missing fur revealing old scars underneath. His ribs were visible beneath his taut skin, and his rain-soaked paws trembled slightly from the biting cold. But despite his pitiful state, he sat with an unusual discipline, unlike the other stray dogs that scavenged for scraps in back alleys. There was something different about him. To most passers-by, he was just another abandoned animal, lost in the chaos of the city. Some averted their gaze, quickening their steps to avoid the discomfort of witnessing suffering up close. Others glanced at him a second longer, perhaps feeling a pang of sympathy before moving on with their own lives. But no one stopped. No one seemed to realize what he truly was. His name was Max. Before being discarded like trash, he had been part of something greater. He had been a K9 officer. For years, he had trained, chased criminals, and protected those who couldn't protect themselves. He had learned to follow commands without hesitation, to sniff out danger, to stand between his handler and any threat. But everything changed the day he was injured in the line of duty. A wound to his hind leg robbed him of his speed, and he was deemed unfit for service. At first, his handler fought to keep him. Police officers often adopt their retired K9 partners. But something went wrong in the system. Max was sent to a shelter, meant to be placed in a loving home. That never happened. Somewhere along the way, the paperwork got lost, and he ended up in the wrong hands. His new owner didn't see a hero, he saw a burden, and one day he simply abandoned him. Now here he was, a soldier without orders, a warrior without a mission, just waiting. The scent of fresh meat gnawed at his starving stomach, but his training held him back. He would never steal, he would never break discipline, he would just wait. And then the soft chime of the butcher shop's door echoed through the damp evening air. A tall man with grained beard and sharp eyes stepped out, carrying a heavy bag of meat. As his gaze landed on Max, he froze. For a moment, he just stood there, frowning as he studied the rain-soaked dog sitting in front of him. Something about this scene felt strangely familiar. The man lingered in the doorway of the butcher shop, gripping the heavy bag of meat as rain dripped from the awning above. His sharp, weathered eyes locked onto the dog sitting on the wet pavement before him. There was something eerily deliberate about the way the animal held himself. Still composed but not defeated, most stray dogs slunk around with their heads low, darting glances toward food with a mix of desperation and fear. But not this one. This one had discipline. Max's eyes remained fixed on the man, unblinking, unwavering. He was soaking wet, his once strong body now gaunt and frail. But there was something unshakable about him. His posture was straight, his ears alert, and even in his weakened state, he radiated a quiet strength. The butcher had seen plenty of strays in his time, mangy, skittish, wild. But this dog had been trained. The realization hit him in pieces. The scars on the dog's legs, the way he didn't beg or whimper, the quiet patience in his stare. It reminded him of something or someone he had seen before. He knelt slightly, setting the bag down beside him, and extended a rough, calloused hand. "You're not just any stray, are you?" he muttered, his voice carrying both curiosity and something deeper, recognition. Max flinched, just slightly, his ears twitching at the movement. But he didn't lunge back. He didn't growl or show his teeth. Instead, he held his ground, his muscles tensed, ready. But for what? For a command? For a signal that never came? The butcher felt something stirred deep in his chest. This dog wasn't acting out of instinct alone. This was learned behavior. This dog wasn't just abandoned, he was discarded. For a long moment, the rain was the only sound between them, soft and steady, like a heartbeat against the concrete. The man exhaled heavily, rubbing a hand over his beard, considering his next move. He had a choice to make. He could walk away like everyone else had. He could pretend he hadn't just locked eyes with something that once had a purpose, a mission, a home. Or he could do what no one else had done. He could stop. Reaching into the bag, he pulled out a small, tender cut of beef and held it out. "Here," he said quietly. "Eat." Max didn't move at first. His eyes flicked between the man and the offering, as if trying to decipher whether this was real. For the first time in what felt like forever, he hesitated, not out of discipline, but out of disbelief. Max's nose twitched as the scent of raw beef filled the damp, cold air. It was rich, fresh, a scent that awakened something primal inside him. His stomach clenched painfully, his body urging him to seize the opportunity to devour the food before it was taken away. But he didn't lunge, he didn't snatch. Even after days without a proper meal, his instincts were still tempered by training. The canine dog didn't take without permission. The canine dog waited for orders. And even now, abandoned and starving, some part of him still clung to those rules. The butcher kept his hand steady, his sharp gaze locked onto the dog as he observed the hesitation, the quiet discipline still embedded deep within him. This was no ordinary stray. A dog living on the streets for too long would have lost that restraint, would have fought for survival with bared teeth and desperation. But this one had known structure, obedience. The realization made something stir inside the man, a sense of familiarity he couldn't quite place. A cold wind swept through the street, rattling the metal sign above the butcher shop's entrance. Max trembled, the rainwater clinging to his fur, making the cold seep into his bones. He couldn't afford to hesitate. Slowly, cautiously, he stretched his neck forward and took the meat from the man's outstretched hand. But he didn't snatch it like a wild animal. He took it gently, almost carefully, as if he still expected some kind of reprimand, as if waiting for the moment when the kindness would be ripped away. The butcher exhaled, his lips pressing into a tight line as he watched the dog chew in slow, deliberate motions. How long had it been since this animal had eaten something fresh? Since he had been offered food by a human rather than scavenging from dumpsters and gutters, the thought unsettled him more than he expected. This dog had belonged to someone once, and someone had let him go. Someone had failed him. He reached into the bag again, this time pulling out another small cut of beef and setting it carefully on the damp pavement. "There's more," he said, his voice lower now. "Take your time." Max finished the first piece before lowering his gaze to the second, his dark eyes flicking up toward the man again, searching him for any sign of a trick, a threat. But he found none, only patience. That was new. Most people ignored him, shooed him away, looked at him with disgust. But this man was different. He wasn't just tossing scraps out of pity. He was watching, studying, trying to understand. The butcher leaned back against the doorframe, crossing his arms, his expression unreadable as he kept his gaze on the rain-soaked dog before him. There was no denying it now. This wasn't just another street mutt. There was a story behind those scars, behind that rigid posture, behind the way he hesitated even when his hunger was unbearable. And something told him it wasn't a good one. The butcher remained leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, his sharp eyes never leaving the dog in front of him. The rain continued to fall in a steady rhythm, drumming against the pavement, soaking into Max's fur. But the dog didn't seem to notice the cold anymore. His attention was focused entirely on the man before him, as if trying to decipher his intentions. He had learned painfully that humans could be unpredictable. Some fed him out of pity, others kicked him away as if he were nothing more than garbage. Trust was a dangerous thing. Max finished the second piece of meat, his movements slow, cautious. He wasn't just eating, he was evaluating, measuring the man's every move, waiting for a reason to run. But the butcher didn't shoo him away, didn't move abruptly or try to reach for him. He just stood there watching in thoughtful silence. "You've seen things, haven't you?" The man muttered mostly to himself. "You're not like the others." There was something in his voice, not just curiosity, but recognition. A flash of movement down the street made Max's ears twitch. A pair of teenagers ran past, their laughter echoing through the wet city night. He barely turned his head, but his muscles tensed for half a second, his body instinctively positioning itself as if ready to react. Not like a stray, like a trained protector. The butcher caught the subtle shift in posture, his brows furrowing slightly. That movement, that reaction, he had seen it before. His jaw tightened, his mind drifted back years, back to long nights patrolling the streets, the familiar presence of a K9 unit walking beside him. The way those dogs moved, alert to every shift in the air, every unfamiliar sound. The same way this dog just reacted now. The realization settled heavily in his chest. "Jesus," he muttered, rubbing a hand over his beard. "You were a cop, weren't you?" The words felt strange coming out of his mouth, but he knew he was right. Max didn't react to the words themselves, but something in his expression flickered just for a second. A ghost of something lost, a memory he couldn't escape. He had once belonged to someone, he had once had a purpose, and then one day he didn't. He had been discarded like an old piece of equipment, left to survive in a world that no longer needed him. The butcher exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He had no idea how this dog had ended up on the streets, but one thing was clear. Max wasn't just another stray, he was something else entirely. And now the question remained, what the hell was he supposed to do about it? The butcher stood in the doorway, rainwater pooling at his feet, his thoughts running faster than he could process. The pieces were coming together now, the posture, the scars, the way the dog reacted to movement, to sounds, to human presence. Max wasn't just a stray, he had been trained, conditioned to obey, to protect, to serve. And yet here he was, abandoned and starving on the streets. Someone had failed him. Max remained still, his deep brown eyes locked onto the man, studying him just as carefully as he was being studied. There was no tail wagging, no excited panting, just quiet observation. He was waiting for something, a command, a sign, an order he no longer expected to come. But the butcher could see it now. Clear as day, this dog had spent his life following orders, and now without them, he was lost. The butcher sighed, rubbing a hand over his beard. He hadn't planned for this. He had woken up this morning expecting another routine day, cutting meat, dealing with customers, locking up at night. He wasn't looking for responsibility, wasn't looking for a new problem to solve. And yet, staring at the dog in front of him, he couldn't bring himself to walk away, not after what he had just realized. Reaching into the bag one last time, he pulled out another small piece of beef and tossed it gently onto the wet pavement. Max's ears flicked, his gaze darting from the food to the man's face. A test, another moment of hesitation, of uncertainty. And then slowly he lowered his head and took the offering, chewing carefully, as if still expecting it to be snatched away. He had been let down before, he was still waiting for it to happen again. The butcher exhaled, glancing down the empty sidewalk, then back at the dog. "All right," he muttered under his breath. "Yes, I don't have a choice now, do I?" The words weren't meant for anyone in particular, but Max's ears perked slightly, catching the change in the man's tone. It wasn't a command, but it was something close to one. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like there was a direction to follow. Without another word, the butcher turned and stepped back inside his shop, leaving the door open just enough. He didn't call the dog, didn't coax him in. He just walked away, leaving the decision in Max's paws. And for the first time in his life, Max had to make a choice for himself. Max stood in the rain, staring at the half-open door. Warm light spilled out onto the wet pavement, contrasting sharply with the cold, empty night behind him. It was an invitation, but not a command. No leash pulling him forward, no sharp voice giving him orders, just a silent offer. And that made it harder. For years, he had followed commands without hesitation, but now he had to decide for himself. His paws shifted against the slick pavement, muscles tense as he hesitated. Trust was dangerous. He had learned that lesson the hard way. The last time he had followed a human, he had been left to rot on the streets. Would this be any different? His instincts screamed at him to be cautious, to back away, to disappear into the night. Survival meant not relying on anyone. Inside, the butcher busied himself wiping down the counter, acting as if he wasn't paying attention. But he was. He could feel the weight of the dog's hesitation. He didn't call out, didn't coax him. If this was going to work, it had to be Max's choice. The dog had been forced into every decision in his life: where to go, when to attack, when to eat. For the first time, he had control. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. Rain dripped from Max's soaked fur, pooling beneath him as his ears flicked. Listening to the quiet hum of the butcher shop, the smell of raw meat lingered in the air. But there was something else, something warmer, the scent of old wood, of metal and spices, of a place that felt safe. Finally, slowly, Max took a step forward. His movements were careful, deliberate, as if expecting the door to slam shut at any moment. But it didn't. No trap, no sudden betrayal, just the steady warmth of the shop enveloping him as he stepped inside, leaving the cold behind. The butcher glanced at him, but said nothing, just gave a small nod, an acknowledgement. He reached down, grabbed a clean towel, and tossed it onto the floor near the dog. "Dry off," he muttered before turning back to his work. It wasn't a command, but for the first time in a long time, Max chose to obey. Max lingered just past the threshold, his soaked paws pressing into the worn wooden floor of the butcher shop. The warmth of the room was almost overwhelming, a stark contrast to the relentless cold he had endured for what felt like an eternity. The air was thick with the scent of fresh meat, metal, and spices, so different from the acrid smells of damp pavement and rotting trash that had become his reality. It should have felt safe, but safety was a feeling he no longer understood. His body remained taut, every muscle coiled as if expecting something to go wrong. A command, a demand, a reason to leave. His ears twitched at the subtle hum of the refrigerators, the soft scrape of a knife against a cutting board, the rhythmic tap of the butcher's boots against the floor. Sounds that were normal to any other animal, but to Max, they were things to analyze, to assess. His instincts told him to be ready for anything. Trust was a weakness, and weakness was dangerous. The butcher continued his work in silence, barely sparing Max a glance. He moved with quiet efficiency, arranging cuts of meat in the display case, wiping down his workspace, tidying up as if an exhausted, half-starved dog hadn't just walked into his shop. There was no urgency, no expectation in his movements. He didn't order Max to stay, nor did he gesture toward the door. He simply let him exist, and somehow that was more unsettling than anything else. Max's gaze drifted downward, landing on the towel the man had tossed onto the floor. It was an offering, a simple one, but an offering nonetheless. For years, he had been conditioned to recognize rewards, to understand when something was given as part of an exchange. Food for obedience, shelter for service. But this had no conditions, and that made it harder to accept. He hesitated, his instincts warring with the deep, aching exhaustion in his bones. He could leave. The door was still open, the night stretching beyond it like a familiar embrace. The streets were harsh, but they were known. Out there, he had control over when he moved, where he slept, how he survived. Here, inside this shop, in this moment of warmth and quiet, he was vulnerable. The weight of that realization nearly pushed him back toward the cold. Nearly, slowly, hesitantly, he lowered himself onto the towel. His movements were stiff, deliberate. his body still primed for a quick escape if needed. He didn't curl up or let himself relax completely. That would come later if it ever did. But for the first time in weeks, he wasn't standing, wasn't pacing, wasn't bracing himself for the next moment of survival. The butcher glanced his way, offering nothing more than a small, approving nod before returning to his work. No praise, no expectation, just quiet acceptance. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Max wasn't just surviving, he was resting. The butcher worked in steady, practiced motions, the rhythmic sound of his knife slicing through meat filling the quiet shop. The only other sound was the hum of the refrigerators and the occasional drip of rainwater from Max's soaked fur onto the wooden floor. Neither of them spoke. Not that Max could, but even if he could, what would he say? The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was something else, something heavier, something that felt like understanding. Max remained stretched out on the towel, though his body never fully relaxed. His ears twitched at every shift in the room, every minor sound outside. Years of training had taught him to be alert, to always be aware of his surroundings. Even now, after exhaustion had nearly crushed him, his instincts refused to let go. Old habits didn't just fade, they clung like scars. The butcher noticed. He glanced at Max every so often, taking in the tension still present in the dog's posture. It was strange watching an animal act like a soldier. He had seen it before, long ago, in canine units he had worked with. Those dogs had a presence about them, something deeper than intelligence or loyalty, a sense of duty that never quite disappeared, even after retirement. Looking at Max now, the butcher saw that same burden weighing on him. "You don't know how to stop, do you?" the butcher muttered, not really expecting an answer. He shook his head, rubbing a hand over his beard. "Damn shame what they do to dogs like you." His voice was gruff, edged with something that almost sounded like regret. Max's ear flicked at the sound, but he didn't move. Minutes passed, maybe more. The rain outside had softened to a light drizzle, the streets growing quieter as the night deepened. The butcher set his knife down, wiping his hands on a rag before finally turning to face the dog. He studied him again, this time with less scrutiny and more consideration. This wasn't just a stray that needed a meal. This was something else, something bigger. With a deep sigh, the butcher reached for a set of keys near the register and walked toward the door. He hesitated only briefly before flipping the lock, securing the shop for the night. The sound of metal clicking into place made Max's head lift slightly. The butcher met his gaze, holding it for a moment before muttering, "Guess that means you're staying." The sound of the lock clicking into place settled into the quiet shop like a final decision. For a moment, Max didn't react. His body remained still, tense as if waiting for something else. A second command, a reason to move, but nothing came. The door was closed, the choice had been made, and for the first time in a long time, it wasn't his burden to make it alone. The butcher exhaled heavily and turned back toward the counter, gathering the leftover scraps from his preparation. He didn't speak, didn't make a show of what he was doing, but when he bent down to set a small dish of meat near Max's towel, the meaning was clear. This wasn't a test, it wasn't an exchange, it was simply an acknowledgement, a silent agreement that Max belonged here, at least for tonight. Max's gaze flicked between the food and the man, his body torn between instinct and exhaustion. For months, he had learned not to trust kindness, to see every outstretched hand as temporary, every act of generosity as something that would eventually be taken away. But this felt different. There was no urgency in the butcher's actions, no expectation in his posture, just quiet patience. Slowly, Max stretched his front legs, shifting forward to eat. He didn't gulp it down like a desperate stray. Instead, he ate with careful, measured bites, his discipline ingrained even in moments of vulnerability. The butcher watched from the counter, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He wasn't just feeding a dog, he was watching something change. As the minutes passed, the warmth of the shop finally began to seep into Max's tired body. His muscles loosened, just slightly, the stiffness in his joints easing as he lay back down. He let out a slow breath, one he hadn't even realized he had been holding. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't just waiting for the next fight. The butcher finished cleaning up, moving through the space with the ease of routine. He glanced once more at the dog lying on the towel, his posture still alert, but no longer on edge. With a small grunt, he muttered, "We'll figure this out tomorrow." Then, without another word, he turned off the lights, leaving only the soft glow from the street lamps filtering through the window. And for the first time in months, Max wasn't alone in the dark. The early morning light crept through the butcher shop's front window, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. The hum of the refrigerators was the only sound in the quiet space, a low, steady rhythm that filled the silence. Max stirred, his ears twitching as the scent of raw meat and coffee drifted through the air. For the first time in months, he had slept without fear. His body was still, his breathing deep and even, no cold pavement beneath him, no distant city noises keeping him on edge. Just warmth, just quiet. Across the room, the butcher stood by the counter, a steaming cup of coffee in his weathered hands. He watched as Max slowly lifted his head, blinking against the soft light. There was something different in the way the dog moved, less tense, less guarded. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something close. The butcher took a slow sip of his coffee and exhaled, as if settling into a decision he had made long before he had even realized it. "Morning soldier," he muttered, his voice rough from sleep. The title slipped out naturally. He had spent years around canine units, seen them work, seen the bond they shared with their handlers. And even though Max had no badge anymore, even though he had been cast aside, the discipline was still there. The soldier in him had never left. Max's ears flicked at the sound of the word, something familiar stirring in his chest. He pushed himself up slowly, his legs still stiff, but no longer trembling with exhaustion. The butcher watched him closely, waiting to see if he would go to the door, if instinct would pull him back into the streets. But Max didn't move toward the exit, not this time. Instead, he took a single step closer. The butcher huffed out a small, amused breath. He set his coffee down, wiped his hands on his apron, then rested one of them on his hip. "All right then," he muttered, nodding toward the back of the shop. "Let's get you fed properly. And after that, well, I could use a good set of eyes around here." His voice was casual, but the weight of his words hung between them. It wasn't an order. It was an offer, a new mission, a new purpose, a new home. Max stood there for a long moment, his head tilting just slightly. Then, as if making a decision for the first time in his life, he followed. And so, Max's journey, from a proud K9 warrior to a starving stray on the rain-soaked streets of New York, comes to a close with an ending that's as heartwarming as it is hopeful. Through every raindrop, every patient gaze from Max, and the quiet kindness of the butcher, we witness the power of trust and the rebirth that can come from the deepest wounds. This isn't just a story about a dog finding a home. It's a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there's a light waiting, if we're brave enough to step toward it. Did Max's resilience move you? Are you curious to hear more touching tales about unsung heroes in the animal world? If so, don't forget to hit that subscribe button on our YouTube channel right now. Every week, we bring you inspiring videos, untold stories, and moments that'll tug at your heartstrings. Join us so you don't miss out on any of the magic. Max and his friends are waiting for you to dive in.